Naomi didn't know the man who had walked her to school and sat at her father's Thanksgiving table was Seoul's most ruthless, silent blade. She didn't know his calm, confident presence masked a billionaire who dismantled empires before breakfast, or that the gray touching his temples only added to his lethal power. All she knew was that Park Jae-hun's dark eyes followed her with an intensity that made her skin burn, far different from the uncle figure she had grown up with. And when they woke up in a bed of white silk, something ancient and irrevocable sparked between them, a recognition that felt like a love trap wrapped in destiny and damnation. He looked at her like she was the one prize he had been forbidden to touch his entire life. Naomi Carter sat upright in the sea of white silk, her striking features clouded by a shock that felt like a soul-shattering realization. This was a luxury penthouse high above Seoul, a fortress where the elite came to hide their sins. Her body language was tense and uncertain, her blonde hair spilling over sheets that emphasized a vulnerability she hadn't felt until this morning. She was here to save her father's legacy, to survive the crushing weight of a debt that wasn't her own. But the price had been an irreversible mistake. The man across from her, neatly groomed and relaxed in a partially unbuttoned white shirt, had been watching her for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Everything was in place for his greatest deal. Everything except her father's forgiveness. You've just stepped into the heart of Seoul. We believe every fortune has a story, and every story has a hidden side. Subscribe to keep your seat at the table. You won't want to miss what we're revealing next. The air in the executive suite was sharp with the scent of cedar and expensive whiskey, a clinical, pressurized silence that made Naomi's heart hammer against her ribs. She stood before the obsidian desk, her fingers trembling as she clutched a folder of overdue notices and bank threats, the jagged pill of her father's failing legacy. Across from her, Park Jae-hun sat with a predatory stillness, his well-built frame relaxed in a partially unbuttoned white shirt. He looked like a god of war who had stumbled into a graveyard of debts, his calm, confident presence radiating an absolute command wrapped in velvet. "I didn't think you'd come, Naomi," Jae-hun murmured, his voice a low, grounded vibration that sent electricity down her spine. He didn't look like the man who had sat at her family's Thanksgiving table. He looked like a predator who had finally scented blood in the water. "Your father is a proud man. He would rather drown than ask for a lifeboat." "He doesn't know I'm here," Naomi whispered, her eyes wide as she met his steady and intimate gaze. The contrast between his composed dominance and her stunned vulnerability felt like a terminal pressure. "Please, Jae-hun, you're his oldest friend. You're the only one who can stop the liquidation." Jae-hun leaned forward, his dark eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin burn, far different from the uncle figure she had grown up with. And when they woke up in a bed of white silk, something ancient and irrevocable sparked between them, a recognition that felt like a love trap wrapped in destiny and damnation. He looked at her like she was the one prize he had been forbidden to touch his entire life. The suit in the digital war room was heavy with the scent of years of unspoken thoughts and tension. He, a god of modern finance, and Naomi, her father's only over-empire, they both knew the scene in the bedroom couldn't be erased by simply turning the page. An intimacy had been forged between them that transcended the years of familiarity. Jae-hun ascended, his back straight as a demanding obelisk, and Naomi followed more slowly behind him. She felt like a child taken to a cave by a giant and hoped the light would be a comfort for her, not a signal to strike. It wasn't just daylight breaking through the windows. It was a new order of the world, a new era in their relationship. She felt like a living, breathing prize he had once been told he could not touch. And now she was under his absolute protection. The clock was ticking, counting down the reality of her father's debt and the anxious uncle whom Hedy should have been returning her calls. The man sitting in the corner chair was the god of war, who had stumbled into a graveyard of debts. Jehan processed her as though she was an asset to be calculated. Naomi was thick enough to understand that this was not a mere emergency. It was the initial dissolution of her family's reputation. She had been given a deliberate offer to meld with Jehan's capital, and her, the inevitable casualty, was now the asset he wanted to reclaim at the auction of her soul. The contrast between his composed dominance and her stunned vulnerability felt like a terminal pressure. The air of their room felt tight and tangible, as though every ounce of oxygen had been calculated by a machine in a digital war room. Naomi had always seen her uncle as a man of warmth and kindness, not the predator who laid in traps for others to fall in. She understood deep down that this was the biggest mistake she had ever made, and she would pay for it every day for the rest of her life, unless she could find a way to repay the debt.
"You're awake," Jehan murmured, his voice a low, grounded vibration that commanded the very air in the room. He didn't move toward her, but his dark eyes followed her with an intensity that made her skin burn. The man who had sat at her family's table, the uncle who had offered a lifeboat to her father, had evaporated. In his place stood the silent Blade, a god of war who had orchestrated a love trap so complex she hadn't even seen the door close. Everything was in place. The debts were cleared, the fortress was built, and the price had been paid in silk and shadows. Naomi clutched the sheets to her chest, her body language tense and uncertain. She saw the bloodless precision in the way he sipped his coffee, the relaxed but deliberate posture of a man who missed nothing. In this world of steel and power, she had found the rescue she prayed for, but as she looked into Jehan's eyes, she realized she was no longer a guest in his home. She was a claimed prize in his kingdom, and the ancient and irrevocable spark between them was the only chain that mattered now. The following weeks were a blur of adjustments, a transition from the modest world Naomi had known to the cold, sterile luxury of a digital war room. Jehan didn't just move her into his penthouse, he installed her within it like a delicate piece of art that required a dedicated security detail. He assigned guards to follow every movement, vetted the very air she breathed, and cleared his schedule to ensure she was never truly alone. The absolute command wrapped in velvet that had lured her into his office was now a gilded leash, a possessive warmth that felt both like sanctuary and a cage. While Naomi was submerged in a sea of white silk and designer gifts, her father was drowning in a different kind of silence. Jehan had cleared the debts, all 12 million, with a clinical finality, but he had also built a wall of encrypted silence between the two men. Naomi's father, a proud man who had spent a lifetime believing Jehan was his brother, now scoured the city for a daughter who had seemingly evaporated into the jagged skyline of Seoul. He didn't know that the god of war had claimed his most precious cargo. Life with Jehan was intense and addictive. He remembered how she took her coffee, bought books he thought she'd enjoy, and watched her with a composed, unreadable intensity that made her skin burn. He was protective to the point of obsession, installing panic buttons throughout the penthouse and instructing the staff that she was to be treated like royalty. When she complained about the smothering attention, he would simply cup her face with his long fingers, his thumb tracing her jaw with devastating gentleness until she forgot to argue. "I'm not comfortable with people serving me," she protested one morning as a housekeeper prepared a breakfast that cost more than her former monthly rent. "Then think of them as helping you," said Jehan, pulling her onto his lap with possessive certainty. "So you can focus on being mine instead of exhausting yourself." The ancient and irrevocable spark between them crackled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. She felt wanted and seen in a way she'd never experienced, but the weight of the secret pressed down on her like a terminal pressure. She was the mafia's princess, living a life of stolen half-hours and high-end luxury, while the ghost of her father's trust haunted every corner of the penthouse. She was safe, cherished, and utterly trapped in a love trap where the price of her father's survival was her own gilded exile. The golden afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, casting long, amber shadows that danced across the white silk sheets. Naomi sat in the center of the vast bed, her blonde hair a bright contrast against the clinical minimalism of Jaehan's sanctuary. He stood by the window, his well-built frame silhouetted against the Seoul skyline, the partially unbuttoned white shirt revealing a man who moved with a predatory stillness. The air was thick with a pressurized silence, a terminal pressure that seemed to always follow his absolute command. "You think this was a coincidence, Naomi?" Jaehan murmured, his voice a low, grounded vibration that made her skin burn. He turned away from the glass, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a love trap tightening. Naomi tightened the grip on the sheets, her body language tense and uncertain. "I thought you were just helping a brother," she whispered, her voice a dry thread. "That's what you told him every year at our table." Jaehan let out a humorless, melodic purr as he crossed the room with a relaxed but deliberate grace. He sat on the edge of the bed, the physical distance between them narrowing until she could scent the cedar and whiskey that defined him. "He hadn't felt like his brother since the day you stepped off the plane from America 3 years ago," he confessed, his gaze steady and intimate. "You were 20, wearing a bright yellow dress that made you look like a miracle in this gray, smog-filled city. I watched you walk through the arrivals gate and I knew." He reached out, his long fingers brushing her cheek with a devastating gentleness that made her breath catch. It was an ancient and irrevocable recognition. While you were studying, while you were laughing with friends I hadn't vetted, I was building this fortress. I knew your father's pride would eventually lead him to ruin. I simply waited for the pattern to complete itself so I could finally claim the one prize I was forbidden to touch. Naomi felt a sharp panic flare, followed by an intoxicating, fearful focus. He hadn't just rescued her, he had hunted her with a savant-like precision for years. The god of war hadn't set a trap for her father, he had set it for her. "You're not a guest here, Naomi," Jaehan whispered, his thumb tracing her jaw with possessive certainty. "You're the destiny I've been mapping since the moment you arrived, and now that you're in my world, the cage is locked from the inside." The clinical silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the cold vibration of a phone against the obsidian kitchen island. Jae-hyun was in the tactical room, his iron control anchored to the flickering data of the shipping markets, unaware that the secrecy and taboo he had built was leaking into the city's underbelly. Outside, the neon haze of Seoul hid the bad snakes of a rival syndicate, men who had spent years watching the silent blade for a single crack in his armor. They had found it in the small, intimate moments, a shared look through a tinted window, a possessive hand on Naomi's waist as they moved from the car to the private elevator. A high-resolution lens had captured the ancient and irrevocable spark between them, freezing a moment of devastating gentleness that was never meant for the public eye. To the underworld, Naomi wasn't just a woman, she was the Trojan horse that could dismantle a billionaire's empire. While Naomi stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling the gilded leash of her new life, a single anonymous message was being routed through a series of encrypted servers. It wasn't sent to the police or the press, but to the one man whose heartbreak would be more lethal than any bullet. In a modest office across the city, Naomi's father sat amidst the ruins of his legacy, his eyes bloodshot from a week of searching for his disappeared daughter. The ping of his phone felt like a terminal pressure. He opened the file, and the world underwent a violent transformation. The photo was clear. His daughter, the miracle he had raised, wrapped in the arms of the man he called brother. The betrayal was a soul-shattering realization that felt like a physical blow. He saw Jae-hyun's calm, confident presence, the way his lethal instruments guarded the girl, and the subtle satisfaction on the face of the man who had supposedly saved him from ruin. The lifeboat hadn't been a gift, it had been a trade. Back in the penthouse, Jae-hyun stepped out of the shadows, his dark eyes following Naomi with a predatory stillness. He sensed the shift in the air, the pre-earthquake silence that precedes a storm. He reached out to touch her blonde hair, but for the first time, the love trap felt cold. The secret was out. The primal fire of her father's rage was ignited, and the first betrayal had officially turned a legacy of love into an all-out declaration of war. The clinical silence of the penthouse shattered as the private elevator hissed open, disgorging a man whose face was a jagged map of grief and fury. Naomi's father didn't wait for the guards to intervene. He stormed into the living area, his eyes fixed on the man standing by the obsidian bar. Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, a god of war in a partially unbuttoned white shirt, his calm, confident presence radiating a terminal pressure. "You took her," Naomi's father rasped, his voice a draw thread that vibrated with a primal fire. He held up the phone, the anonymous photo glowing like a brand in the amber light of the room. "You sat at my table, looked me in the eye, and took my daughter to pay for my mistakes?" Naomi stepped forward, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulders as she moved into the space between the two men. Her body language was tense and uncertain, caught in a dangerous bubble of authority and betrayal. "Dad, please," she whispered, her eyes wide with a stunned vulnerability. "He cleared the debt. He saved us." "He trapped us, Naomi," her father roared, the sound echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass. He turned his gaze toward Jae-hyun, the man he had once called brother. "Is this what she was worth to you? 12 million for a girl you weren't supposed to touch?" Jae-hyun set his whiskey glass down with a rhythmic clicking that cut through the rage. He moved with a lethal elegance, stepping toward Naomi and placing a possessive hand on her waist. The physical distance between the three of them narrowed until the air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a physical blow. "I didn't take anything she didn't choose to give," Jae-hyun murmured, his voice a low, metic purr of absolute command. The debt was the catalyst, but this, he gestured between himself and Naomi, was an ancient and irrevocable recognition. I have been waiting for her since she arrived. The confrontation felt like a terminal pressure, a public showdown in a private fortress. Naomi looked from her father's heart-shattered expression to Jae-hyun's composed dominance. She saw the lethal instruments of Jae-hyun's security detail shifting in the shadows, ready to act on a single command. The love trap had finally sprung, and as her father reached for her, Naomi realized that the silken shadows of her new life had created a wall she couldn't climb back over. She was the prize in a war between the two most important men in her life, and the first casualty was the trust that had once kept them all safe. The aftermath of the confrontation left the penthouse air pressurized and cold, a pre-earthquake silence that Naomi felt in the marrow of her bones. Her father had been escorted out, not with violence, but with the clinical, soul-shattering finality of Jae-hyun's iron control. Now, Jae-hyun stood in the tactical room, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting in his dark eyes as he shed the uncle mask completely. The god of war had returned to his graveyard, and the bad snakes who had leaked the photo were about to learn that touching his miracle required a payment in blood. "Park," Jae-hyun murmured, his voice a low, metic purr that signaled terminal pressure. The rival syndicate in the Gangnam district. They thought a lens could dismantle an empire. Show them the cost of the observation. Naomi watched from the doorway, her body language tense and uncertain. She saw the lethal instruments of his security detail move with a heavy, rhythmic discipline, armoring themselves for a coordinated strike that would burn the city's underworld to the ground. This wasn't the man who bought her books or remembered her coffee. This was a predator executing a master plan. The strike was swift, merciless and absolute. From the monitors, Naomi saw the fractured pieces of the mission, the deafening crash of doors, the rhythmic strokes of a clinical execution, and the primal fire that consumed the rivals' digital and physical assets. Jae-hyun didn't look away. He watched the destruction with a composed dominance, his fingers moving across the glass tablet with a savant-like precision to override the city's traffic grid, ensuring no one escaped his reach. When he finally turned to her, his white shirt was still crisp, but his aura was heavy with the scent of cedar, smoke, and something darker. He crossed the room in long, deliberate strides, his gaze steady and intimate. He cupped her face with his long fingers, his thumb tracing her jaw with a devastating gentleness that felt like a brand. "I told you I would build a fortress, Naomi," he whispered, his voice a low, grounded vibration. "A fortress isn't just made of stone, it's made of the bones of those who try to breach it." Naomi should have been horrified by the monster before her, but in the wake of the violence, all she felt was a terrifying sense of being cherished. The love trap had been reinforced with iron and blood. She was the mafia's princess, and as Jae-hyun pulled her into a possessive embrace, she realized that the price of her safety was a world she no longer recognized. The clinical blue glow of the penthouse was replaced by the cold, flickering red and blue of sirens reflecting off the jagged glass of the Seoul skyline. The coordinated strike had left a digital trail that even Jae-hyun's iron control couldn't fully scrub, and now the heavy weight of the law was pressing against the doors of the fortress. Naomi stood in the center of the living area, her striking features pale under the terminal pressure of the shifting night. The elevator didn't hiss open with her father this time. Instead, a stone-faced operative from the authorities stepped out, holding a folder that represented the absolute command of a different kind of power. They didn't see a girl in love. They saw a valuable asset who could dismantle a billionaire's empire of blood with a single statement. "Your father is in our protection, Naomi," the agent murmured, his voice lacking the velvet command of Jae-hyun. "He's broken, but he's willing to forgive everything if you walk out that door right now. Tell us about the Silent Blade. Tell us about the price he made you pay for that $12 million debt." Naomi felt a sharp panic flare, a violent surge of emotion that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She looked at the door, the path to her father's forgiveness, and the ordinary life she had abandoned, and then she looked at Jae-hyun. He remained perfectly still by the obsidian desk, his well-built frame silhouetted against the sirens. He didn't plead. He didn't use his lethal instruments to stop her. He simply watched her with a composed, unreadable intensity, his dark eyes fixed on her with an ancient and irrevocable spark. "I'm not a victim, and I'm not a trade," Naomi whispered, her voice dropping to a low, grounded vibration that surprised even her. She saw the way Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, a subtle satisfaction flickering in his gaze despite the danger. The choice was a jagged pill. To choose her father was to return to the light, but lose the monster who had looked at her like oxygen when he was drowning. To choose Jae-hyun was to embrace the secrecy and taboo forever, staining her hands with the same empire of blood that protected her. The love trap had finally reached its terminal pressure. As the FBI moved to take Jae-hyun into custody, Naomi realized that her loyalty wasn't a debt to be paid. It was a fearless presence she was finally ready to claim. The legal storm that had threatened to dismantle Park Jae-hyun's empire eventually receded, leaving behind a world that had undergone a violent clinical transformation. The sirens had faded, and the red and blue flicker against the glass was replaced by the soft, golden light of a late autumn afternoon. In the quiet of the penthouse, the air no longer carried the pressurized weight of a digital war room. Instead, it held a new, grounded warmth, the scent of cedar mixed with the fresh promise of a beginning that didn't require a Trojan horse to survive. Jae-hyun sat at his obsidian desk, but he wasn't tracking shipping lanes or executing coordinated strikes. Before him lay a single, heavy vellum folder, the final contract. It was a document that officially transitioned his family's empire of blood into legitimate enterprises, using his multi-billion-dollar power to protect rather than destroy. He picked up his fountain pen, his iron control steady as he signed his name, a motion that felt like an ancient and irrevocable vow. He was stepping away from the shadows, letting go of the silent blade persona, to become the man Naomi had glimpsed beneath the armor. Naomi stood by the window, her striking features radiant as she looked out over the city. She was no longer a prize trapped in a love trap or a valuable asset to be traded. She moved towards him with a quiet, observant grace, her blonde hair falling over the shoulders of a white silk dress that mirrored the purity of the new life they were building. The physical distance between them, once a source of secrecy and taboo, had vanished, replaced by a steady and intimate connection. "It's done," Naomi murmured, his voice a low, commanding hum that lacked its usual lethal edge. He stood up, his composed dominance softening into a look of absolute certainty as he reached for her. He took her hand, his long fingers interlacing with hers, and led her towards the balcony. They stood together as the sun set over Seoul, a fearless presence in a world that still feared his name, but would now respect his legacy. He hadn't just saved her from a debt, he had built a new kingdom, where the miracle he had rescued was now his equal. The legacy of love was the only deal he intended to keep forever, a soul-connecting bond that turned a monster into a husband. As the city lights began to glow, Jae-hin leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that was gentle and consuming, a final seal on the contract of a lifetime.